Set up the recording, and now I'm going to share my screen. It is, what is it, July 11th already, almost the middle of the month, and we're going to talk about pattern and texture today. So, share screen, and then get this going. Oops, escape out. I always do that. I always go through the slides in the morning just to make sure I remember everything, and then I forget to go back to the beginning. Oh, and one other thing, I'm going to escape one more time. I'm going to minimize this. There we go. Okay. Oh, and got the wrong keynote loaded. There we go. Takes a few minutes. Okay. All right. You did have a question last week about pattern and texture, which most of you remembered to answer. And they're very closely related, as I'm sure you just instinctively understand, even if you haven't had a design class. So there are some slight differences between the two. So we talk about pattern when we talk about creating visual interest. Psychologists have an actual term for our human need to fill empty surfaces, which whenever I go over this chapter and I say those words, I wonder, well, what about the minimalists? You know, are they missing that gene? Are they missing that impulse to fill up empty spaces? Because I certainly have a couple of friends who are very good at living with very little around them, and they seem pretty normal other than that. But here we have an example of more common human nature or human impulse, and that is to fill up empty spaces. And we have a teenager in his bedroom and this amazing collage that he's created from magazine photographs. I don't know if you did that when you were a teenager. I know I certainly had a lot of stuff on the wall. So a pattern is the repetition of some kind of a design motif. And we see pattern in nature all the time. We see pattern in the seasons. We see pattern in lunar cycles. We see simple patterns in things like grass or leaf patterns. We see more intricate patterns, and we see a lot of more intricate patterns in art and craft. Pattern involves having some kind of order, yet incorporating variety into that order. I'd say most patterns that are created are based on some type of grid to give them that sense of order. But as you can see in this Escher drawing, there's a lot of variety within the grid. It's really interesting to analyze an Escher drawing the way our book has done and break it down into the elements and see just how amazing it is that he was able to create so many fascinating patterns. So you begin with a unit or a shape that is repeated. And as we learned earlier, there's a name for that all-over pattern. It's crystallographic. And you can make patterns out of almost any type of unit or motif. It can be abstract, it can be floral, you can have geometric patterns. And they're just built on an almost infinite variety of symmetries, repetitions, and rotations. So again, there's a larger picture here of one of Escher's pattern drawings, and then a little detail showing you the triangle. So there's can identify the hexagon, let's see, 6, hexagon, and the triangle in his work. Now, texture is similar to pattern, very similar to pattern, but it tends to arouse our sense of feel. It makes an object look like it has a surface quality. So you can have pattern without having texture. You can't really have texture without having some sort of a pattern. Texture does tend to be a little more irregular than a pattern, and it has a lot of time a little more gradation in light to dark. So it may have abrupt changes, light to dark, that would make you think that there's an edge there, or it can slowly undulate or slowly fade from black to white or gray to white. That gives you more of a feel of a fold or an undulation. It can be glossy, it can be rough looking, but it makes you think that you can reach out and feel it. There's a beautiful example here, which is a photograph of a piece of pleated silk fabric. Doesn't even look like fabric at this magnification. Texture evokes a memory of touch. So if you take a look at this photograph that has been cropped in to just really be about angles, color, and texture, you've ever touched a stone wall, you can look at that lower left section of this photograph and you can feel, you know what it's like to touch that wall. Same thing with the shingles on the roof, the boards on the red section of the house, the feeling of the window that has wood dividing it up. All those things evoke a memory of what it feels like to actually touch those things. And then I'm sure you all are aware that ceramics and furniture and fiber art rely on texture a lot to enhance their individuality and the artist's eye or taste. And in interior design, there's a lot of sensitivity to different types of texture. There are two categories of artistic texture. There's the texture that can be actually felt, and that is called tactile. And then there's texture that can be observed. Looks like we can feel it, but we can't. And that is implied texture. There are a couple different types of tactile paintings. Impasto, which we're going to take a quick look at next, which creates a paint using really thick, a painting which uses really thick paint that creates an actual 3D surface. And then relief paintings, which are very similar and create that tactile surface. So here's actual texture on a Van Gogh. And if you've seen a Van Gogh in a museum, even though you're not allowed to actually reach out there and touch it, you're usually able to get close enough so that you can, turn your head from side to side and see the shadows and the light and actually see the raised surface of the paint. So it kind of evolved in painting as the need for illusionary painting receded as we came more into the 19th and 20th century. Then artists were free to work a little bit more with texture in their painting. They didn't have to have it look like a photograph. And Van Gogh was one of the earliest ones. This is an example of implied texture where you have a lot of visual interest And as you look at that background area with all the dots, you might think that it would have a little bit of a rough surface, but it's actually very flat because this is a screen print. So it's perfectly flat and smooth. So if you have a surface that gives the illusion that there is a texture when in reality there is not, that's called implied. You can create tactile texture very easily with collage. I'm sure when you were all in elementary and maybe even middle school and beyond, you were encouraged to create things using a variety of materials, fabric, magazines, paper, bits of wallpaper that had texture, all kinds of things, wood, just anything you could bring into a classroom. Sometimes you use all these textures to create a picture. Sometimes, like this one by Anne Ryan, they're more made to celebrate the changes in texture and probably the colors that we can't really see on this black and white version. You can also use found materials to create tactile. A lot of painters use actual earth or sand. There's another example in the book with pebbles. This one uses found objects, found pieces of aluminum and copper wire to create this 3D sculpture. And it's often used not only in contemporary art like this piece, but in folk art. There's a word called verisimilitude, which means truly the same. And that is something that is employed by photorealistic painters. They use visual texture that really creates the impression of texture on their smooth, flat canvas. This is an example of that. We actually look, or it seems as though we could touch that glass and there would be edges. It would be that beveled type of glass that you see in older buildings. So very, very close to realism. I've been practicing this word all morning. I can't roll my R's very well, but trompe-l'œil is the French term that means to fool the eye. And here is an example of a very well done, it's a bridge overpass, and it has a painting along the wall. It makes it look like it has a lot of architectural detail, stone and elements that protrude from the stone and they have depth, but it's all painting. So we're fooled by this momentarily, but we usually realize that it is not, in fact, stone and masonry, but it is a painting. You do this yourself in Photoshop when you use the bevel and emboss, and some of our other artistic filters to make your obviously very flat, can't be flatter than a screen, compositions look like they have some depth and some 3-dimension. So you'll use an attention to detail. Low relief usually works better than trying to make things that stand out quite a lot, and shallow space textures. So here's an example of Ruchas, Rouchet, sorry, it's Rouchet. I've been really working on my pronunciation of these artists and terms. It's a painting, oil on canvas, but it looks like plastic or enamel, something that sticks up from the surface, but it is a very flat painting. Okay, and that completes our chapter on pattern and texture. I'm going to stop sharing now and stop recording and turn it over to you guys.